Dirty Birds, what's up? And welcome to another edition of Falcons Final Whistle. I am your host, Will McFadden. I am joined by Tori McElhaney. And Tori, it feels like a long time since we've been in the studio together. It's not been as long for you because you did a solo pod that everybody should go check out. It was, not as timely now, right?
Yeah.
But it was the 5 candidates that you thought made sense for the Falcons at defensive coordinator. They have since made that hire. Jeff Ulbrich coming back to Atlanta after a few years spent in the Big Apple. He was on your
New
list.
Jersey.
Well, I'm not as familiar up with that area, but he was on your list of 5 candidates. So what was your initial reaction when you saw that Jeff Ulbrich was going to be the pick?
Well, I think that I knew it was less about my feelings and more about what I immediately knew the fan base was going to feel.
You're such a professional.
And I know. I just care so much.
I'm all in my feelings. I'm all about me. Yeah. This is about Will.
This is my time to shine. But no, I was sitting there, and I was actually, what's funny is the news broke on a Saturday, and I actually was home visiting my family over the weekend, and we were on our way to my sister's basketball game in Rome, and I'm in the back seat of the car, working on stuff, and I just the whole entire time was like, the loudest faction of the fan base is going to have very strong opinions about this hire. And I didn't think that it was going to be an announcement that was met with a lot of excitement by the fan base, if I'm being completely honest. And looking back at once the Falcons did announce that it was Ulbrich, kind of the response was exactly what I thought it was going to be from the fans. Everybody being very skeptical about it, being a bit apprehensive. To a certain extent, even some frustration and a little bit of vitriol. I think that I knew it was going to be something that I don't think a lot of people were going to agree with in the fan base, because it goes back to what I said in that podcast that you were talking about, where I laid out these candidates and I kind of did a pro and a con for, who they were, what they do, and them coming to Atlanta. And with Jeff Ulbrich, it was is it a little bit of a been there, done that? Yeah,
I mean, in the mailbag, as I was kind of trying to get a pulse for the people who didn't hit me up on Twitter, and there were many, many, many of them, but a common word is retread, right? And that is the other sentiment to this, right? And in this particular question, it says, hiring Ulbrich won't move the needle. I don't know what needle fans necessarily are focused on at this point in time, right? Is it a splashy hiring that is going to get everybody talking about you? Or is it ultimately something that is going to pay dividends on the field? And in my mind, sooner rather than later, because I think that that's the timeline that this current organization is operating on, right? Is you want to win now. You wrote a great column after the season talking about kind of the window and the clock is ticking, given the rookie contract for Drake London, given the rookie contract for Bijan Robinson, and now Michael Penix Jr., who, I just continue the further away from the season we get. I'm just my excitement is growing for, I think, what he can be based on what we saw in those 3 games. So, you want to maximize, I think, this window, and now the attention turns to the defensive side of the ball. And I think that's where my first reaction was, yes, there's a lot of familiarity here, but is that a bad thing necessarily, right? Because if you want to hit the ground running, it makes sense to bring in somebody that literally they worked together in this capacity in an interim role back in 2020, and the results weren't that bad.
Yeah, and I think that too, I get it, and I think too that I think about course correction a lot in your decision making, and I feel like if I'm Raheem Morris, and he has stated time and time again that he kind of wants to be this 5,000-foot view operator of the organization, kind of like a CEO, and then you trust your VPs or executives to handle their responsibilities. And I think that it probably got to the point last season where he was having to spend more time than maybe what he would like within the minutia game planning of what the Falcons were doing defensively. And I think that because of this Jeff Ulbrich hire, it allows Raheem to immediately have someone come in, who he trusts, who has experience calling games, who at this level, who, let's be honest, if you look at what the Jets have done defensively over the last few years especially, granted I know that it's Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh probably together.
Yeah, I know but like Robert Saleh took that same approach. I went back and read a lot of the stuff when he was hired. He said, look, Jeff Ulbrich's going to be the play caller. He wants to be that CEO type of, again, I'm overseeing the organization. And I think that just misunderstands how, frankly, involved with a lot of stuff not necessarily related to the product on the field that a head coach has to deal with.
I think you think about what the Jets were having to deal with during the last couple of years with the Aaron Rodgers stuff.
Organization was not the pinnacle of sports.
You can't tell me that Robert Saleh was sitting there every single week just going over the game plan with Jeff Ulbrich and being like, all right, man, go execute this. Like, I wrote it up for you. Like, there were so many things happening within that organization that were pulling.
The only thing working was defense.
Right.
So I think his attention as the head coach was on a lot of this stuff not working. It was probably trying to manage Garrett Wilson being like, how I'm not getting the ball, man, or Breece Hall, and kind of that whole conundrum.
The whole Aaron Rodgers of it all. Yeah. I mean, I think like that's the thing is like we don't know. We're not in the building with the Jets. We don't know how much like what that working relationship was with Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich. All we can go off of.
But neither are the people who were saying it was all Robert Saleh.
Exactly. So I think like that. But to the point that we're making is like Raheem wants to be this CEO and to trust his guys to come up with a game plan, and they can bring the game plan to him and he can go, okay, I like this, maybe tweak this here, all right, go back and do that. That's what he wants. And with Jeff Ulbrich, I think it lends itself to immediately, to your point, kind of this idea of hitting the ground running. He can come in and they can meld their plans and their ideas together because it's something they've done before. And but again, I think that it's really hard. I understand like the fan base's frustration to kind of be like, well, didn't we already try this? Didn't we already do this? I think
which is fair.
I think both of these things, it's the same, it's a different side of the same coin to have frustration about this hire while also kind of looking at the facts of the matter and you can understand it and also maybe not have made the decision if you were in the decision maker's shoes, and it's all fair.
Right. But to your point, and there's I'm of a couple of minds about this. First, it felt like at the end of the 2020 season, given where the organization had been, starting in kind of that Super Bowl and then in the aftermath, like that point felt much more urgent in the sense of we need to kind of like shake some things up within the organization, and they did. And then the grass wasn't necessarily greener, right? And in the meantime, you had Raheem Morris go to LA, win a Super Bowl as the defensive coordinator, work, really good like wonders with both a veteran and an experienced group, but then also that last year in 2023 with a young group. And you saw that he could kind of do both things. And then to your point, Jeff Ulbrich is in New York, and I've got some of the numbers here. They were over the last 3 seasons, so this is including 2024, first in yards allowed per play. They were first in first downs per pass attempt. They were first in passer rating allowed. They were second in defensive success rate. And they were third worst in average starting field position. So they were set up by offenses completely putting them in tough spots, and yet they still came through time and time again. And I would say, to the Robert Saleh point, like the defense getting worse may have something to do with him leaving, but it may also have something to do with the defensive coordinator elevating up to that head coaching role and just being able to spend less time on that. So I look at what they're both kind of coming back to do together. And I think the interim tags that they had in 2020, that's always a little bit complicated, right? Because you're not necessarily having an offseason, or you're not having an offseason to implement your vision, your style. You're taking over the reins for somebody else. Right. And I do think that they worked pretty well in that role. They were dead last in defensive EPA that season, and they finished 15th, right? So we were both covering the team there at that point. What do you, when you think back to that time, what do you remember hearing Raheem and Ulbrich say that, you think will translate here or won't?
I think that at that time, it's in the middle of the pandemic, and they just parted ways with Dan Quinn. And I remember the first few Zoom calls, because we were doing Zoom calls.
We were.
I remember those first few Zoom calls with Raheem in the interim spot and then Ulbrich in the DC spot. And I will give credit where credit is due. I thought that the way that they handled that whole season from a leadership standpoint, having to deal with COVID testing and having to deal with the roster literally changing daily to a certain extent when there were these like pockets of COVID outbreaks and having to change meeting styles and having to do different things. And I mean, I was really at the time impressed by their ability not just to handle all of that, not just to handle the firing of Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff in season, but I appreciated from a media perspective how transparent they were about all of the things that, they're not good enough here, we're not good enough here, we're not good enough here. Here's what we think is going to work by changing X, Y, or Z. I have a hard time like pulling examples because it's been so long. But I remember one time Jeff Ulbrich was talking about, I think he was talking about like Foye and how he was somebody who he could envision being such a good, well-rounded linebacker.
Yeah.
And how smart he was and how he really wanted to tap into him and really like bring him along. And I think about what Foye ended up turning into and the contract that he got with the Jaguars. And I just use that as an example that was somebody who Jeff Ulbrich was like, I really feel strongly that this guy can be somebody really, really good. And for a while there, I think 2 years in a row, he led the league in tackles for both the Falcons and his first year with the Jaguars. So that's just like an example of I think they could always see the bigger picture. And even in the midst of probably one of the most chaotic years, not just life, but in Falcons organization. So that is, I always said, like, I, as a person, have always respected and genuinely liked Raheem Morris and Jeff Ulbrich as people. I think if I'm a player, I would want to work with those type of guys, like those type of coaches.
And I think that's the main part to maybe sell this hire, right? Not that that's what we're here to try to do, but just to present that argument for why this, could ultimately really work is because Jeff Ulbrich spent a decade in this league as a player, as a linebacker for the 49ers. So he can speak to the player as a player, right? And kind of has that, I think, player first mentality as a head coach. I was working for the organization at that time, so you were external with The Athletic, but I saw him in the hallway. I kind of got to know him a little bit, and I mean, he's very laid back. He's calm. He's never going to get too high or too low. He's going to kind of embrace that mentorship role, and I think Foye is a perfect example of how he can elevate and work with a player to really grow and develop them. Foye was a 6th-round pick as a safety out of Yale. Those guys don't turn into two-time NFL leading tacklers who get second contracts as, big players on the free agency market. And he helped develop him. I think Devondre Campbell turning into an all-pro. I know it wasn't here in Atlanta, but when he was drafted, he was widely considered to be like a toolsy prospect who needed a lot of development. And how many times have we seen players with much higher draft pedigrees be kind of this like versatile joker player who's got like this range and they never really manifest, but he has. And the last we saw of him was not necessarily the highlight of his career, but again, that's besides the point. I think Deion Jones, Devondre Campbell, Foye, those guys are a testament to what he can do as a coach, as a position coach, and now he gets to kind of work with the entire defense. So is there anybody on this defense, position group or player specific, do you think really stands to benefit from his presence?
I mean, I think like we have to talk about the linebackers, the inside linebackers, because that is Jeff Ulbrich's
your favorite position.
I love them. Yeah, I love them. If I was a man, I would maybe want to be an inside linebacker. Like if I got to play football.
I see that.
Because I always would tell my dad, like growing up, because flag football for women wasn't like or girls wasn't really a thing in my high school, like growing up. So I never got the chance to play football like ever, and I remember telling him, I was like, I want to be a tight end or an inside linebacker. Like that was always the goal. So I gravitate towards.
I played tight end, so you can play linebacker.
There we go. Yeah. So anyways, that's beside the point. That was a tangent, but I really think that group is at a crossroads right now. And I think obviously you saw, and I wrote about this past week as we were doing like position reviews for every single position group on the team. And I was talking about what Caden Ellis was able to do in 2024 was very special. But what happens around him moving forward is going to be, I don't know, it's going to be tough, and it's really hard to predict at this point because okay, Caden Ellis has one more year in Atlanta under contract. Nate Landman's a restricted free agent this year. I would imagine that they would bring him back because you can bring him back on a league minimum. Right. Troy Anderson and J.D. Bertrand are both on their rookie deals. Troy Anderson would be on the last year of his rookie deal. And I think that the style of play, like thinking about, we just talked about the inside linebacker group that Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris had the last time they were here compared to this group, vastly different in terms of, I think, how they play, their roles within the defense.
Weirdly, the closest comp is, I think, Troy Anderson and Devondre.
Yes, yeah.
Is like those two guys, to me, fit that mold of like really toolsy but need a little bit of work.
Yeah, and I think that because we just haven't seen Troy Anderson, he's been hurt. Like way more than he's not been hurt.
But when he's out there, he's like a comet in the sky. You're like, oh, look at that big, beautiful thing, and then it's gone.
Oh, it's gone, yeah. And so I really am curious to see what Jeff Ulbrich does with that group, and if they bring some different guys in, if there is maybe some draft strategy involved in filling out that position a little bit, or if Jeff Ulbrich comes in and is like, I actually really like these guys and I want to see what they got.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's always an option too, and you hope that you can get the best out of that group, because I do think outside of Caden, you need a bit more out of that inside linebacker group, and I think that's the group that, if I'm thinking about Jeff Ulbrich coming in and really you can feel his stamp on something, it's going to be with that group, which he is kind of the core of not only who he is, but I think the defenses that he operates out of.
Yeah, the other thought that I had on that is when Devondre Campbell was drafted, I know that for a couple of years there, they really wanted to have him be in that pseudo pass rusher role. Like that was something, I think he ultimately ended up being better in coverage than he was as a pass rusher. But early on, they had him working with a lot of those like edge rushers to try to utilize that size, that skill set. So it's interesting that Caden is not, I would not compare those two guys in terms of like body style or anything like that, but
intention
maybe it's like, all right, I finally got the guy that I want to use in this way. And then the other person I thought of was D'Angelo Malone, right? And I believe he's another free agent candidate here, does he have one more year on his deal? Anyway, we'll have to look that up. But he was selected in that final draft class with DQ and with Thomas, and another kind of tweener type of player where you can see, all right, is he a linebacker? Is he an edge? What do we do with him? So there are some interesting pieces. Now, there's not, a Quincy Williams or a CJ Mosley type of player on this defense, but I do think the linebackers are going to stand to benefit. What about maybe some of the defensive line guys, the edge guys and interior?
Well, I think they've got to develop some talent. Not because I think about it this way, Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata are they're aging D tackles, and
we're all aging.
We're all aging. I know. Don't remind me. As someone who has a birthday coming up.
Yeah, birthday's coming up.
Don't remind me.
I'm not far behind you.
But I think that you've got to develop someone like Ruka Rororo. If he is kind of the heir apparent to that position group. Zach Harrison. I thought Zach Harrison did some really good things this past year.
He's a player that I immediately thought of.
Yeah, I really think that. And I'm curious to see what they want to do with him because, this past offseason.
I feel so bad for him.
I know. This past offseason, he bulked up, had to put on a lot of weight because they really wanted him to play more interior.
Yep.
And even though that his first year was a bit more coming off the edge out of Ohio State, that was what he did at Ohio State. And now I'm kind of like, are they going to want him to revert back to what he was. But I also think that he was doing some good things.
He was. He figured it out.
Yeah.
It's like Chris Pratt when he goes from Andy Dwyer to like Star-Lord,
Yeah.
and they're just having him lose 60 pounds and then like put 60 pounds back on, but he's like good in both roles.
Right.
That's exactly how I think of Zach Harrison.
Yeah. But I think he's somebody that I'm curious to see what Jeff Ulbrich thinks of him coming in, and if he feels like, hey, this is a guy who, in just looking at the interior, can be a major part of what they want to do. And also, I think like the elephant in the room as well is Grady Jarrett. Yeah. And I got a question. And the reason I bring this up is because I got a question about it in the mailbag about what do you do with Grady Jarrett? And because he doesn't have any guaranteed money left on his contract. Yep. If the Falcons were to release him prior to June 1, according to Over the Cap, they would save, I think it's like just over $16 million towards the cap.
I'm looking it up right now. Because you're not wrong. If people, so it's like 16.25. Yeah. So exactly there. And I mean, David Onyemata as well. So like you mentioned both of those. It's less. It's about half of that number.
But it's still a number. And I personally, I can't, because I know how, I mean, I just spent an entire offseason with Grady Jarrett, like completely embedded into his 10 years in Atlanta and his road to recovering, getting back from the ACL injury last offseason. And I know this season wasn't as productive as we've known Grady Jarrett to be, but I kind of expected that coming off of that injury. But I can't imagine. So I will say I'm not impartial about this. Like, I'm not. And I can't imagine an Atlanta Falcons team without Grady Jarrett. But I also thought the same thing about Matt Ryan. And
True. And Julio.
I thought that these core group of guys who are a part of that Super Bowl run, like I felt as though they would retire as Falcons and would play their final season in an Atlanta Falcons uniform. And the reality of the situation is that this is a business, and $16 million towards the cap when you're kind of in that little, like, right on the line, you don't have that much that you can maneuver and do. It's not like you're going to go out and make the splashiest of signings. You're not going to go out and get another Jesse Bates. Like, You're not going to go out and give Kirk Cousins the contract that you gave him last offseason. Yeah. You have to be way more strategic with things this offseason. And I think, like, that's the question, too, is, like, okay, Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris, they know firsthand what Grady Jarrett is to this organization. And I think that is another reason why I'm like, there's no way that they would be like, all right, bye, man. Like, thanks for 10 years, but you're going to save us $16 million. Like, I don't see that happening, but crazier things have happened.
Yeah, and I mean, there could potentially be options on the table, right? Do you restructure him? Do you extend him a little bit and lower that number in year one? But you look at, and this is, I'm not going to make you actually do this, but it's an interesting exercise for people to think, because you and I are both in agreement that Kaleb McGary had a good year this year. He is a younger player. I think he is firmly in his prime, and with more years ahead of him, they're close in what you could save. You know, like, these are the decisions that you have to weigh. Is like, all right, do we look at maybe needing a right tackle? Do we look at adding somebody to defensive line? Like, that's the tough situation that the Falcons are in.
Yeah.
That's all kind of to come. Last question for you before we wrap up, because this will be the last time we talk before I head down to Mobile for the Senior Bowl.
Heyo.
So looking at the draft, 15, I think we're all in agreement the defense probably should be the way that they go.
Yes.
But
I've also said that picks. The last 4 draft cycles.
It's so hard. Yeah, it's so hard. But if let's say we narrow it down to the defense and you have your pick of maybe number 2 options, not the first player on each board, but like edge rusher, cornerback, interior guy, where's your head at?
I think 15 is prime real estate for a corner or an edge rusher. Okay. And I think that those are the two positions that I think are your premium positions. I don't think that unless you can figure out a way to maneuver the cap and you have more money to make a splash signing, those are always going to be expensive guys.
Yep.
Those veterans that are proven at those positions are expensive, and I worry that they would be out of the price range of the Falcons at this point. I've said this every single year since A.J. Terrell was drafted to the Falcons, that I would love to see some consistency at the position opposite him.
Yeah.
Every single year, and I can't remember if I've even said this on the podcast, but every single year it's been someone new, someone different. And while that I don't think changes the way that AJ plays, because cornerback, especially outside, you're on an island. Like it's not like a pairing.
Right.
But
if anything, it helps him, I think, a little bit. Because
right.
they're like, all right, we'll go this way.
Exactly. And so I think that I would love to see a corner taken at number if you stay at number 15. Also, I think something else.
It'd been nice to see like Quinyon Mitchell or
yeah, I know.
like or any of those guys.
Yeah, there were so many things, but I think too, like I wouldn't, because of the fact that the Falcons sent a 3rd round pick up to New England for Matthew Judon. They lost out on 5th round pick because of the tampering violation. I think that they would be a little bit draft capital hungry and would be willing to make a move to move down if they foresee some top defensive prospects, considering how deep the draft class is defensively. If they feel like they can still stay in the realm of being able to get their guy. Now, we have so many months and months and months about this, but I right now, and as I'm probably going to go into mock drafts and everything in the coming months, just edge rusher and corner, edge rusher corner, edge rusher corner.
It's mock draft season, but you're right. The early rumblings are that this isn't a top-heavy draft, kind of like this last one was, where you look at the first rounders and like, man, left and right, there's a lot of really good players that came out of this draft, and I think MPJ will be one of them. But it looks like rounds 2 through 4 is where the meat of this draft is. So could you slide back a little bit, pick up a couple more day 2 picks, and feel a little bit better about bolstering the defensive side of the ball?
The problem is that you have to hit on those picks.
Yes,
you know, like
100%.
those are going to have to be guys that you feel don't need a whole lot of development, because they got to come in and play and produce immediately.
This can't be a shotgun approach. It's got to be a sniper approach.
Right. Yeah, and I think about like the Matthew Bergeron pick in day 2. And what he has.
I think he's been a good player.
I do too. I think he's been consistent, and the fact that he had never played that specific position ever.
And forever we were talking about the left guard spot. Just like
to not
year
have
in
to
and
talk
year
about
out.
it.
You were saying the number 2 corner spot, that was like
that
the
was
left guard award.
Yeah. It literally is just shifted to a new position. But no, I think about like it's going to have to be that caliber of player 100%. That can come in and be the guy immediately.
Awesome. Well, that will do it for us today. Next week, at some point, I will hope to maybe have a Senior Bowl recap or speak to some people down at the Senior Bowl. Producer Sam and I are going to get together and try to figure that out later today. But then we also expect to hear from Jeff Ulbrich at some point in the future, and I believe you will try to do a recap of that conversation with Taryn Walk. So everybody, please stay tuned for that. But thank you so much for listening. You can watch us on YouTube. Be sure you're following the Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network for everything Falcons Audible, Falcons in Focus, and Falcons Final Whistle. As always, today's show was presented by Zaxby's. For Tori McElhaney, I'm Will McFadden. We will see you guys next time. Today's episode of Falcons Final Whistle is brought to you by Zaxby's. And after a long game, when I'm tired and I need to refuel, I turn to Zaxby's. Their marinated, hand-breaded, fried to perfection chicken fingers, they hit the spot every time. Get yours with seasoned crinkle fries, a nice drink, and whichever of their 12 signature sauces you're feeling at the moment. But it always hits just right. So next time you need to refuel, go get yourself some Zaxby's.